Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 16 of Circle of Fellows. This is the monthly Google Hangout on Air broadcast, which becomes a podcast in which a group of IABC Fellows get together and discuss generally the editorial theme from IABC for the month. And this month, that theme is communicating in a multi-generational workforce. I'm Shel Holtz. I am an IABC Fellow. I am also of the FIR Podcast Network, where this is available as a podcast. And I have three fellows with me today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we may have a fourth joining us if he's, I think he's joining us as we speak. But let's start the introductions. I like to do this in the completely random order of how your thumbnails appear in the Google Hangout. So Angela, you're first.
Oh, okay. Going from the right, I'm Angela Sinicus. I'm an IABC Fellow. I'm the CEO of my own company, Sinicus Communications, Inc. And what I focus on is research and measurement for communications, even though I've done all kinds of internal and external within corporations and consultancies. So when I'm talking today, I'm probably going to refer a little bit to some of the research we've done.
I'm hoping that we can talk about research and put some numbers and some data to this. Mark, you're next.
Hey there, I'm Mark Schumann, also an IABC Fellow, and I am an executive coach. And so I work with business leaders across generations, representing all generations. And then I'm also the Director of Graduate Communication Studies in the Business School at Baruch College in New York City. So I teach MBA students and work with, I feel like I'm getting my major in millennials. So,
and a former chair of IABC, right?
Yes.
Terrific. Jim.
Jim Schaefer. I lead the Jim Schaefer Group. We focus on managing communication to better execute strategy, the business strategy. Focus a lot on large-scale organizational change and performance improvements in all parts of a business. I'm also a fellow, and prior to starting my own firm, I was with Towers Perrin with Mark Schumann, and now I'm enjoying myself in my own firm.
And Paul, can you hear us? Apparently not. If Paul Sanchez is able to join us, we will have him introduce himself when he does. He was having some technical challenges with the Google Plus Hangout on Air, which never happens, ever, to anybody. So let's start the conversation with an observation, and that is that there currently are 5 distinct generations represented in the workforce. I have a 95-year-old father-in-law who still goes to work 3 days a week. And no doubt there are also millennials in the organization where he works and everything in between. My father-in-law was with OSS in World War II, just to put some context around that. And one of the arguments about communicating differently to different organizations is based on the fact that they have different life experiences, major experiences that occurred in the world, that occurred in the news, that shaped their worldview. They were raised with a different set of values, and they approach work differently, including the perspective, the perception they have about how work fits into the rest of their lives, how they should be treated, and how they should contribute. So I think soon we'll have 6 generations in the workplace, because whatever we're going to call the next generation, I've heard Generation Z, but I've also heard some other labels. I'm sure we'll settle on something at some point. But the oldest of them are just getting out of college. So 6 generations in the workforce, all with different views of work and their role in it. It sounds like you have to personalize everything to everybody in order to communicate. Well, let's start with communicating to the workforce, and then we'll talk about cross communication. But I have to tell you, I read an article that I loved, and what the article suggested is that you need to also consider a demographic group that they labeled perennials. And I feel like I fit into the perennial demographic because it has no age associated with it. These are people who stay up with the new technology, stay engaged regardless of their age. So if we count perennials, there's 7. Do we really need to communicate differently in the collateral and the materials that we send and what they see on the intranet, how we ask them to collaborate? That seems like a lot of personalization and a lot of work.
Well, Shel, just to get us started, I'd like to offer perhaps a surprising observation. This is nothing new. When we were the age of today's millennials and communicating in organizations, we had to communicate across generations. It's been a fact of life since communication in organizations became a part of organizational life. So it's nothing new. And we had to, in our years, be concerned no matter what generation we were a part of. So the focus on what it takes to reach people has always varied by the experience people have and the values that people share. The big difference from my perspective this time around is it's all so much more in view. And there are so many more choices that people have in how they receive and also how we deliver and how people connect. So I would move that we've always been sensitive to this, should always have been focused on this. It's just today it all is a lot more in view.
I would have to agree, because I remember when I first joined the workforce, I was in the baby boom generation.
Yeah.
And what people said about us is that we didn't respect authority and tradition. We were trying to get ahead too quickly before paying our dues. Yeah. We were wanting to shake everything up and disrupt. So in many ways, it's I think there was one of the articles that I read too, is it's not just a factor of age, it's also a factor of things like your life stage. So I think when I, and then also when some of these younger millennials get to the point of being married and having a mortgage or families, sometimes you have to start changing the way you operate at work. Like, for example, I used to work just my regular 35 hours a week or 37 hours a week at my job. And, was doing quite well until I went into consulting. They said, if you want to become a partner, you're going to have to work more like 60 to 70 hours a week. What? But that partnership, that'll help pay the mortgage. So work with something to slot into my life rather than vice versa. But that shifted.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Mark and Angela on that. I really don't think this is new conceptually. Particularly for people who manage communication and change in organizations. I had the same experience that Angela referred to. Remember the baby boom generation was the me generation. We thought we were pretty hot stuff because we were big and all the other things that people said about us. But once we got into a company, an organization, we found out that there was somebody who was even bigger than you. You were competing with people who were older and smarter than you in many respects and brought new and different ideas as we did. But really what drove everything that was being done there was not me, it was about the customer. And I think that we kind of lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of ways to segment people, gender, races, Myers-Briggs types, socioeconomic backgrounds. Generations is just another one. But I believe the leveling influence that we have in organizations is that we can help people have a sense of purpose around customers, and customers have specific requirements that need to be made. It's like a football team. We all come with different strengths, but we focus on the opposition in the case of a sporting event. So I think this is nothing new. It's just we need to make sure that we are aligned around a purpose, a vision, and a strategy, and that's the role of leadership communication in the organization to a great extent.
And I do think that's where there's been a change, and I don't know if it's necessarily a generational change based on age or stage, but it certainly is a change based upon leadership practice. And what I see the most difference in the leaders I coach is those who are either participants in or directly influenced by the command and control generation, who are now trying to change to a much more inclusive, engaging generation. And that's a huge shift when you've been trained by one set of behaviors and you're trying to adapt into another set of behaviors, and younger leaders who don't necessarily understand nor accept the subtleties of that change get a bit frustrated. So that's a very real shift between generations of how leaders have been leading organizations.
And I think the other thing is the channels available for those leaders to communicate and obviously corporate communicators to communicate. I mean, when I was first in the workforce, we had a company magazine, we had team meetings, maybe we might have a big group meeting from time to time, but that was about it. And so now we've got so many more options where we've really got to be very strategic about what we use for which messages with which audiences and who the owner of the message is.
You know, one of the things that drives me crazy is generalizations. I'm looking at this chart that I shared with you, and they're talking about 3 generations: boomers, Gen X, and millennials. And, you know, they have pros and cons. So for us boomers, we're productive, hardworking team players and mentors, which is kind of the opposite, Angela, of what you said the perception was when we were first coming into the workplace. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, through the late 70s, the cons are less adaptable, less collaborative. And, you know, the collaborative, I think, is probably true because when we came into the workplace, knowledge and information were power. Yeah. You didn't part with it willingly. That was your capital in the organization, and you exchanged it in order to get something of value that you needed from somebody else. So this idea now that we're all going to hop onto Slack and start sharing our knowledge as soon as somebody needs it, that's a little alien. But you know, I'm also looking at the pros and cons on millennials who get an inordinate amount of attention these days. And, you know, the pros are enthusiastic, tech-savvy, entrepreneurial, and opportunistic. The cons are lazy, unproductive, and self-obsessed. You know, that's Mark Zuckerberg that they're talking about there. I heard an interview with a millennial. I can't remember what radio program or podcast it was, but this woman was saying, you know, we're saddled with this characteristic of wanting to be nomadic and not wanting to own homes because home ownership among millennials is so low. She says, it's got nothing to do with it. We can't afford it. We can't afford to get into the housing market. Right. So there are all these assumptions made. So I guess, Angela, what I would wonder from you is, rather than base communication practices on broad generalizations and assumptions, or at least using them as some base to start from, isn't it important to do some research in your workforce and find out where the values and characteristics actually make a difference, and figure out from actual data how we should be communicating?
What a great idea. That's
unbelievable. Yeah.
For existence for me. No, completely. Now, here's a couple of things, though. Usually when I do communication surveys for clients, I recommend only using demographic options that you can actually act on. So, for example, you could communicate differently with different job levels. You could communicate differently by region, some kind of geography, and sometimes by business function. So those are useful demographics. And I usually discourage them from putting on things like age and tenure, because you can't say, hey, we're going to have social media for all you young folks and all of you old guys can come to the town hall. We're going to offer all those options. And the reason we're going to do that is when we have a critical mass of people, regardless of age, that will support that kind of a channel. So I have only 3 surveys done in the last couple of years where we do have age as a criterion, where it's really interesting. There's very few trends when you look at those 3 companies and you look at different age demographics. But I think the point I'm trying to make is we need to look at not who individually wants different channels, but are enough people really valuing certain channels that it's worth our time and resources to create them and use them.
Angela, I'm curious. I changed from ages to generational ranges in my surveys that I do. I don't do length of service because it correlates so strongly most of the time with age. But have you switched how you ask those questions? It used to be 15 to 35, 35 to 40. And now I'm breaking those out and seeing some significant differences in the generational groupings for those ages in the surveys.
What we've typically done, and it varies by client, they've got different reasons for wanting to do this, but we sort of look at those age ranges for the different generations of millennials or Gen X, and at whatever year that is, that's what we base the age range on for the survey. So if we repeat the same survey 2 or 3 years later, we would change the age ranges.
Right.
Before we go any further, I want to let those who are watching live know that you can ask questions. If you have a question on this topic for the panel, use Twitter and use the hashtag COF16. That's for Circle of Fellows, episode 16, COF16. And I'm watching the Twitter stream for that hashtag, and we'll pass any questions that come along to the panel.
So just some of the things that I've seen, which is really crazy when I put these 3 different surveys together, we're looking at some things like how interested are people in different topics and how well informed do they feel? And are there generational differences? Well, sort of, but it's not a trend. So in 2 out of these 3 companies, the younger folks were more interested in a lot of topics, and the older people were less interested in one company. I'm sorry, and they were less interested in one company. When we look at how well informed they are, in one of those 3 companies, the younger people felt better informed than average. In the other 2, they were the average. I mean, so there's really, I did not see a trend of 3 out of 3 companies going the same direction on anything from how they value the communication climate at the organization, whether they're getting too much or too little of different types of channels, or how useful different channels are. But we can get into those specificities when it comes up in the conversation.
And what I find in my life with millennials in the classroom, and most of the people that I teach are working full-time people who are going to business school part-time. They would answer this question less in terms of age and more in terms of life experience, but even more so in terms of realistic habit. They will use their smartphone as a communication tool simply because their only free time during the day is the 41 minutes on the subway, and that gives them the chance to connect. So it's not even an answer based on intent. It's just an answer based on real life. And when you're a working person and you're working all day and you have 41 minutes to get to school, that becomes the communication window. So it goes back to some of the fundamental things we've always looked at, which is what is the available time and what do people hold in their hand? And how do we match what they hold and the time they have to reach them, regardless of their age?
Well, one of the interesting observations that I had from a CEO I was speaking with yesterday, he runs a company that has an internet in the cloud solution. And he said, I'm a boomer, so I am still fully invested in email as a key communication channel. I almost pounded my head on the desk because I'm a boomer and would love to see email just vanish completely. But yeah, I think he has a point that we get accustomed to the tools that we use when we're in the workplace, and along come all of these other things. But I'm comfortable with email. We look at the millennials and the Gen Z that's following them, and they're using Snapchat, right? And I think a lot of organizations are figuring out that we need to do some communication via Snapchat, mostly for external. There's a great Snapchat account from Cisco Systems called We Are Cisco. It's an employee takeover account. So every day a different employee in a different part of the world takes it over. And it's designed to convey the culture of the organization. It's for employer branding purposes. So it's definitely aimed at the millennial and Gen Z demographics, but it's incredibly successful. I thought it was a smart move. And Paul Sanchez has joined us. So let's take a quick digression so Paul can introduce himself.
Good morning, everybody. I apologize for my late arrival. I have been in the business about 30 years in various forms, mostly in consulting. Recently, I'm an adjunct professor at the Communication College at Loyola Marymount University. And one of the interesting things is to see in a classroom how varying age groups respond to both discussion and items. So I'll turn it back to you, Shel. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I was just making the observation that different generations do tend to embrace different technologies. And I think the problem that a lot of communicators would have with that, I know I've heard it before, is, oh my God, one more channel that I have to use to communicate. I'm overwhelmed with these.
Well, then employees on the other end are overwhelmed with the options. They don't know which ones to look at for which types of information, so they don't miss anything important. So just on your point of generations using different channels, so we had 2 companies where we asked people which types of social media they use in their personal lives and how often they do, which is a really useful question to ask because the answers are quite different at every different company. But so out of those 2 companies, the younger generation was more likely to use Facebook than average more often, in 2 out of those 3, but not the third. They were also at one company more likely to use LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. But the interesting one, since we're on a Google Plus Hangout, is that they are less likely to use Google Plus, and the age group of 51 and over was more likely to use Google Plus. So, hey guys, here we are.
Yeah, actually, just for what it's worth, Google has decoupled the Hangouts from Google Plus. It's now just Google Hangouts on air, and you do it through YouTube. And I think that's Google's recognition that nobody really ever embraced Google Plus. So, like most of Google's other attempts at social media, wasn't a rousing success.
One of the things that fascinates me most, reaching beyond, and I love those factoids, Angela, reaching beyond the channel factoid is the hunger factoid, and what is the difference in what different generations hunger for. And certainly leaders look for different hungers they need to satisfy. And so I again refer to some of my students, and I had students who pursued this topic and found that their peers, and their peers are in the clearly right smack dab in the middle of the millennials, the hunger that they have for truth and authenticity from leaders, they found less satisfying to be delivered through conventional media or through any kind of formal media. And the demand was for just those channels that you described from the olden days of face-to-face communication. And so their hunger for face-to-face is something that they're even finding a little bit frustrating to satisfy with all these media choices. I found that really interesting.
So on that point, with one company, we had people who said the 31 to 40 age group said they were getting too little face-to-face communication.
Yeah.
But at another company, the generation just younger than them, the under 30, they said they're getting the right amount of face-to-face, and they were the only ones happy with it. So maybe they expected less. I don't know. But again, this is where each company is so different, and also how they're using these tools is different.
Yeah, and were these, I'm assuming, Angela, these were different industries as well, because different industries could reflect that sort of thing. An engineering company and a newspaper or publishing company would have maybe different kinds of responses.
Right. One was financial services, one was heavily manufacturing, like big stuff, and then another one sort of a half and half sales organization and some manufacturing in some parts of the world. So yeah, 3 completely different organizations.
Yeah.
Can I put in a word on that particular topic, because it was discussed pretty heavily by a group of people who were graduate students, but who all were employed in different industries in and around the Southern California area. And what they pointed out was that there was a distinct difference between the topics of communication and the preferred medium under those circumstances. In other words, if you're talking about maybe compensation, they'd like that to be very personal and to be authentic. Whereas if you were talking about opening a new plant in South America, well, that could be by any form that the company is regularly using. But I think too often we're ready to separate the topic from the medium. And I have found that there's really a huge desire to be tailored, particularly among the older groups.
Oh, every group, because this is years ago, there was a big study done through IABC that said the supervisor's employees' preferred communication source. And that's because the question asked on the survey was, pick one out of all these channels where you want to get all of your company information. Well, it's a stupid question, but people did answer it. And then we got a stupid answer that we spent 20 years trying to make the supervisor the main channel of all communication. But when I do these surveys, we ask it by topic, and you're absolutely absolutely right. It varies completely by topic. And just to this point on the younger generation, I was looking at these results by generation, and in only one company was there a stronger preference for using social media on a particular topic, and that was for local news.
Angela, I think
the only topic they were more likely to want to learn about it through social media.
Angela, I think we were part of the same discussion with the Harvard Business Review, if you recall, about the supervisor and the preferred source.
Yep.
Yeah. One of the things that I did recently is I did a survey of communication practitioners, mostly leaders of different industries, different businesses. And I asked them about segmentation in the sense of different channels and different information. They all said, yes, we believe we ought to do that for the purposes of the different generations. I asked them if it was an issue in their organization. 70, 80% said yes. I asked them if the issue has caused any business results problems, and only about 10% said yes. I said, why are we caring about it if it's not really contributing to the problems? Because we're trying to avoid those problems, was the only response that I got. So I know that there's the issue about how much I like something or I don't like something, but are we focusing on bringing the generations together to create better results, to create better synergy among people, capitalizing on people's differences so that we can have smarter solutions for our customers? Or are we focusing on communication for communication's sake? I just throw that question out.
I think we need to chew on that. In the meantime, we've had more people join us live, and I want to let you know that you can ask questions through Twitter with the hashtag COF16, Circle of Fellows 16, COF16 will answer your question. So far, we have one tweet that says, great discussion. So, Catherine, thank you for that. I want to throw something out. I think there are characteristics of generations that are worth looking at. As I was studying Gen X, when Gen X was first starting to come into the workplace, one of their characteristics was they watched their parents toil away 12, 13, 14 hours a day and then get laid off 3 years before they vested in their 401ks. And their generational reaction to that was not me. So that loyalty that you saw from the boomers, Gen X didn't have. They were inclined, and still are, to stay at an organization long enough to suck up knowledge and experience. And as soon as they perceive there's nothing left to gain from that, they're off to the next company.
Well, we've done that too. We've done that too, Shell. You and I, all of our careers, most of us have jumped around about every 5 years, 5 to 7 years.
But the recruiters are noting that resumes among the boomers tend to have 2-3 companies on it, and among Gen X, they tend to have 8 or 10 companies on it. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, you'd have to look within those long sieges with companies and see how many times people reinvented. But one of the things that I think is important in this conversation is that when we research certainly the hunger that people have, we also need to at the same time take a hard look at how the companies over the years have delivered to satisfy that hunger. And it's all a moment in time. And I go back to some employer brand work a few years ago for a company where we were talking with young millennials at that point. And their most significant influence had been watching their parents, but it wasn't watching their parents work too hard. It was watching their parents lose their jobs. It was watching their parents not being able to afford to perhaps continue sending these kids to school. And so their need for and hunger for security surpassed at that point the cool factor. And their main evaluator in looking at places to work was who might still be here in 5 years and who might still need me in 5 years. And if I have to wash my dog at home, I can probably cope with that if there is security. And it was a fascinating lesson to me that we get so caught up, back to Jim's point, in communications for our own sake, that we sometimes maybe lose sight of the fundamentals that people have to find in a place where they work.
Hey, Mark, could I add a comment to that? Because there was recently a Gallup study that talked about was there a noticeable or perhaps singular difference between each of the each of the groups, each of the cohorts. And what they found was that on the topic side, there wasn't a whole lot of difference. In other words, they still wanted to understand the value of the organization. They still wanted to understand were they being treated fairly, what their other opportunities for career growth were, which, by the way, was relatively high. And under those circumstances, it puts more pressure on us understanding what the preferred methods are, the preferred media, because they are willing to listen to things in different channels, but they still want the same kind of information, or at least largely want to have those same questions answered that you articulated.
And they want to be in conversation. And if we're going to look at what certainly we observe and what we experience every day in organizations, is the demand for authentic interaction, the demand for authentic involvement is different in this generation, whether we measure that by a passage of time in an organization or a change in people. But the demand for conversation and engagement is very different. We were, as much as we were the me generation, we also were the generation that followed the rules because we wanted to keep the job. And we didn't demand the same level of interaction that I certainly experience in organizations today. And I would be curious, Angela and Jim, if the research you do supports that.
Go ahead, Angela.
Well, I mean, it depends on the questions you're asking. So, for example, when we ask people where they want to learn about different types of information, they tend to be channels that are one way. That not on all topics. And when it's about your compensation, when it's about how you can contribute to your the strategy of the company, then they want some face-to-face interaction with the job-related stuff with their supervisor, with bigger strategic stuff with higher-level people. But for the most part, people are not their preferred source. Now, the social media also are not a preferred source for getting information. So when we ask that question, you're not going to see social media as a preferred source by very many people. But once they've had the information provided, they want to discuss it. And especially if it's a spread out organization, if people work from home, then the social media approach is the way to go to get that conversation going.
And certainly as you look at how they work and how people work today being so different, with not all being under one roof and being connected in all kinds of ways, yet still wanting that authentic connection.
It's interesting having the conversation about social media. I read a piece, it was published by Deloitte by John Seeley Brown and John Hagel, about introducing a collaborative software tool into an organization. And, you know, what most organizations do is IT is behind it. They make sure that it works. All the bits travel to where they're supposed to go. And then they say, here it is, everybody, a collaborative network, Godspeed. And it's left to each individual to figure out how to use it. And those are usually terrible failures. What they did in this organization was they identified a department that dealt with a lot of exceptions. And they define an exception as something outside the norm of what you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Suddenly you're faced with a question or a challenge or a problem or an interruption that you don't routinely deal with and you don't have the answer to. So this department pilot tested the collaborative software and found that they were able to deal with these exceptions much more quickly. And they became the champions for the software when it was rolled out company-wide. And what was interesting is this was a bunch of grizzled older guys who had moved into the office environment from the production environment, and they didn't like collaborative technology. But when they saw how this actually helped them do their work more efficiently and reduce friction and hassle, they embraced it tremendously. So, you know, I think that you have to look at the introduction of social media strategically, and the people who you're rolling it out to don't necessarily know what they don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you, Shell, and it goes back to a little bit what I was talking about why we do this. I was talking to a large restaurant chain just, earlier this week, And they were talking about 60 to 70% of their people are millennials, a lot of single mothers who have to communicate that I'm going to be a bit late to the restaurant where they're working, or a chef in a kitchen in Orlando who needs to find out why this recipe that you sent me is not working. And so he or she sends out messages, which they have set up so that they can get instant reactions from other chefs who have said, I tried the same thing, add 2 more tablespoons of water and it'll work, and it did, et cetera, et cetera. So I think really if we're adding value in the whole communication business, we're helping to change work so results change, presumably improve. So I think one of the key things is, as we think from a communication perspective, is how can we provide the kind of means, whether it's the channels and distribution methods and the information that help people do their jobs, what's in it for them, how they can do their jobs better so that the organization does better because the customer requirements have been met. I think if we focus on those things and invest in that sort of thing, we're going to be more likely to be accused of adding value to the organization instead of just producing a lot of activity.
Catherine Mitchell has a question. Let me throw a question here from the viewer audience. And it's a great question. How do you think the CEO's generation identity affects expectations about communications within the organization? Is it a factor?
Huge.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
I would, in fact, I would quote this wonderful book by a man named Jim Schaefer called The Leadership Solution. And in that book, Jim examines how we have to, as people in business, get underneath what the CEO's habits, preferences, and certainly communication inclinations may be. But in the work that I do, and I work with a lot of executives who are really trying to figure this one out, how do I stay relevant to people across generations, is a question they ask all the time. But it's not a question that is asked, or it's not a question answered by what communication channel do I choose. It's a question answered by how do I, just as Jim was just describing, how do I support people wanting to get work done? Because one thing that is certainly true of each generation in its own way is the desire to come to work and to get things done. And CEOs are quite in tune to, if I'm not relevant to how people get work done, then they'll find someone else who is relevant. And that is very top of mind.
And this, I think, explains why even when we have social media available in companies, they don't get a lot of uptake, even in companies where there's a lot of younger people. Just because they use social media in their personal lives doesn't mean they're going to just jump on social media because it's there. There has to be a point to it. It has to be a safe place. It has to be a useful place. Otherwise, they're going to ignore it, even though they like social media in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading Stephen Waddington, who was the chair of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations in the UK. He's with one of the big PR agencies. I can't remember if it's Hill & Knowlton or somebody else, but he wrote a post that they have adopted in his company. I think now that I think about it, I think he's Ketchum. They've adopted Facebook Workplace, which is essentially Facebook for your company. And he says it's a game changer because everybody knows how to set up a page. Everybody knows how to set up a group. Everybody knows how to contribute to a conversation. And rather than introduce something that was created for the workplace, just using what they're already familiar with has encouraged people to use the channel.
Right. I was mentioning earlier before we went on the air that in the final exam for my MBA students is the question, what will the impact be on business leaders searching for ways to connect with their employees, to have a new role model in the White House called Tweeter-in-Chief, who is setting a different course of communicating directly with stakeholders that we haven't seen before. And how will that change how business leaders look at their own communication responsibilities?
Interesting, Shell, your point there, this restaurant chain that I'm talking about, one of the things that the head of communication told me is that they actually have set up social media to compete with Facebook because they know that Facebook works, that approach works, and they're using that much more for their communication out into the organization.
Yeah, it's interesting. Richard Edelman, in the wake of the release of the Trust Barometer from Edelman this year, has said that it's time to acknowledge that we're in the era of the social CEO because of expectations from stakeholders that they be transparent and visible and accessible. So you're seeing CEOs of companies like eBay and several others that have Facebook pages, not just their personal profile, but a page that they use to engage with their stakeholders in conversation through Facebook primarily. There are some using other channels, but let me shift gears a little bit here and talk about our role as communicators in facilitating communication among employees. And there is a generational challenge. I hear about it all the time here in the Bay Area because I'm close to Silicon Valley, that the younger employees who don't have kids, and many of them aren't married, will get to work at 7 in the morning and not leave until 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. The older employees who have families are trying to leave at 5 or 6 and go spend time at home. Their perception of work-life balance is different, and what happens is the younger employees resent the older employees for leaving. Even though they may be working at home and getting stuff done, it's, hey, we're here working and you're off to the soccer game. How do we influence the culture in order to create acceptance of these different behaviors?
Well, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. I think the customer is a leveling influence here. Think of a football team, San Francisco 49ers, for your benefit, Shell.
Oh, please, no.
Okay, well, I won't refer to anybody who may be revolting on that team or causing a brand problem on that team. But
I'm just thinking that they're 1-11. So
maybe it's cause and effect. My point here is that if we have clear customer requirements and we know what those requirements are, this team also knows it has. I'm going to give you a perfect example. I was working with a client in Lubbock, Texas. One of the things that we were attempting to do is improve on-time delivery. Their on-time delivery was 29%. It was largely because there was not a conversation going between the inbound inventory, the parts assembly, the polishing, and the shipping and receiving. And we had different generations, different people from different places, different countries, came together, and they did have to work together to map the process and to identify solutions. And they had to work late at night. They had different shifts who were working on this project. And they put it together, and within about 4 to 5 weeks, they had hit 99% on-time delivery. So, and nobody was sitting there complaining about it because they knew that this is what had to be done for the customer, because the customer's paying our bills. We were losing customers because we couldn't get products to the customer on time. What they did is generate a 30% increase in sales. So yeah, these people have got to learn how to work together, that these are our values. These are our rules about how we work together. And we can't just go home and say bye-bye, or you know where you're going to stand on the team. They're not going to invite you to the next whatever.
Can I add a comment to that? I was with a group of business leaders in the San Diego area, and it was a group of people who ran medium size and had some larger size divisions in the course of the discussion. One of the things that came up was the difficulty that leaders, and particularly CEOs, when they're engaged in culture change or wanting to move the organization in a certain strategic direction, their concern was that so much of the work now is dispersed, and that there are a number of organizations who have a strategy of having at-home workers, so they don't have the opportunity to be in a work community other than when they may have to come together for a particular event in the organization. But by and large, day after day, they're working at home. And I find that is becoming more and more difficult challenge for people in communications and in human resources and at the top of the house, because they can't get to people as easily as they did before. Given all of the media that we have, if they're not that face-to-face component, it frustrates or degrades what they're trying to do.
But I think it requires that we ask a question, not only of ourselves as well as the people we're trying to reach. Is part of this generational shift a redefinition of what face-to-face means? Is the part of the generational change a redefinition of what a conversation is? Because, you know, with my children, with my students, when I say I just chatted, my generation might think that meant that there was a voice involved. Their generation might say, we had a great conversation and we never said a word. We thumbed that way through that conversation, but we still exchanged. And I think part of our challenge is to look at these common experiences that people have through a different set of eyes, because it may be that we have to, from this generation, embrace technology to create the connection that younger generations take for granted.
Well, and I've had to do that with my surveys. I used to have a section called face-to-face communication. Now it's called leadership communication. It's called interpersonal communication, right. But it's no longer face-to-face. Yeah. But I think there's also something that has happened, and I've read about this and I've experienced it with young people in my own life, is that with this reliance now on technology to have quote unquote conversations, that there's actually a loss in ability to have face-to-face conversations. In that, for example, some of these folks that are spending most of their time chatting online are not as attuned to facial expressions or sarcasm or irony. And so that starts creating a communication problem when you do get face-to-face.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
I have a friend who works remotely. I'm not sure where his company is, but he works out of his house in New Hampshire. But once a week, he's expected to fly out to the company so that they can all be face-to-face. I heard somebody once say any communication that isn't face-to-face is a corruption of face-to-face communication, because we're hardwired to see facial expressions and to see body language, and you lose that in anything else. One of the tools that has emerged to deal with that, I think people who aren't using it regularly think it's kind of silly and unprofessional, emoji, right? Mm-hmm. But I read a linguist, a scholar, say, look, if I can add an emoji to a message that conveys what I feel that you understand, so I don't have to take 50 words to try to explain that to you, then that's worthwhile. And yet I threw out on LinkedIn in an employee communication forum, how many of you are using emoji in formal communication in the company? And not one. They all said it's unprofessional. Is it time for communicators to start to embrace the tools that are working for a certain generation that replaces what we see in face-to-face communication with expression and body language and the like?
Well, it's already starting to happen automatically. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you use, at least when I use texting, sometimes when I'm typing a word, an automatic emoji pops up for me to use. Has that happened to anyone yet?
Yes, no? Absolutely.
Yep.
Yes.
And what's going to be happening apparently is branding, where different companies, like let's say that I'm talking about drinking wine, and instead of a wine glass popping up, it would be a wine bottle with the name of a particular brand. I could choose which brand of wine bottle I want to add into my text message. So there's the next level of emojis.
So the difference between a Cabernet bottle and a Chardonnay bottle.
No, between brands, not just
between brands. Okay.
Yes, for advertising, a new way to get advertising into texting, the one area they haven't been able to get into yet.
And I would suggest, going back to something we said at the front of the conversation, this is nothing new. That had we been having this conversation, or the generations before us had this conversation back in the 70s, when there wasn't a gray hair to be found among this group, and they would be struggling with the same things. Only then it was something different. It was perhaps the fact that, well, just think about the revolution that was created when there was this new invention called desktop publishing, and it could actually put publishing in the hands of the people. There was a lot of fear, and I think we have to caution ourselves not to overreact to the fact that life and the ways people connect continue to change, and that's fine.
Just a reminder, as we have about 10 minutes left, to those who are watching live, feel free to send us a question. Use Twitter and the hashtag COF16. I think another issue that I'm hearing a lot about, Jerry Corbett, a former chair of PRSA, is dealing with this quite a bit in his work, and that's ageism. There are fewer boomers retiring than we're expected to. We are staying in the workforce a lot, looking for new jobs and not getting the interview opportunities because a 30-something manager does not want to have a 60-something employee reporting to them. This is an issue that relates to this whole topic of generations.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I have a solution, but
you've stated the problem.
Yes. But can communication do something to help alleviate this, to address this, communicating to managers in the workplace the value of hiring older workers, or how to manage an older worker, or something like that?
It could be part of the whole diversity and inclusion approach, because I don't think age is something that we've often included in that.
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree.
I had a conversation, this has been a few years, with a search consultant called me to get names, like many do every day, to get names of people to consider for a particular job. And this search consultant, actually in a violation of ethics, in my perspective, asked me the age, and then told me that they couldn't imagine someone of that age having been able to keep current. And it just lit a fire in me that has not died, because you know, keeping current and staying connected and being relevant is not a function of age. It's a function of curiosity. It's a function of passion. It's a function of dedication to a craft. And so I think that as a profession, if we have done anything to contribute to this, it's that we make such a big deal over the cool things that enter our world. And as we discuss those cool things, we have to ask ourselves, are we suggesting that they are only for the young? And are we creating a context that makes this issue something that we should pay attention to? And actually, Shell, I think this could be a show all on its own. It's like,
yeah, and I think the flip side is equally true. I think there's an assumption that's made that with younger workers, everything is digital. I was really interested to see that books are coming back, paper books. The expectation of the publishing industry was that sale of ebooks would hit 50% of all books sold. It maxed out at 20 and is dipping again. And even school kids prefer to read books in print. And I wonder if we have been too hasty in abandoning print in communication when it still delivers value. Shouldn't we be looking at that strategically, and where does print make sense, rather than say, oh, our younger employees would never read print?
And see, even that's not true, because I have a client where this is a big question. A new CEO came on board and said, should we keep printing a copy of this magazine? It's expensive. We translate it to different languages. We ship it all over. And so one of the things we did was we focused on the research on that. And it turned out, regardless of age, and we found this out in focus groups as well, print does serve a purpose, especially for something like a magazine, because it doesn't work very well on your mobile phone. Because you're not reading such long pieces on your phone. But what they were saying is the print will sit on my desk. So when I'm on a webinar like this, I can multitask. I can actually read a couple of articles. But if it's been sent to me as a link or online, I'm only going to get to a little bit of it and I'll never get back to it. So these days, print is the new shiny thing because it hasn't been around for a while. And it does get some attention.
You know, I see that, Angela, I see that on airplanes. There was a big movement toward iPads, and I use an iPad all the time. But all of a sudden, I'm starting to see more and more people with books. And I was sitting next to somebody recently on a flight, and I asked why she moved back. And she says, because I can smell it, and I can touch all this paper, and it feels so good to me. She was about 30 years old.
Well, and mobile too. You mentioned mobile at the beginning of this. You know, we're assuming that the younger folks are the ones who really are demanding mobile. But with one company where we asked people about their appetite for having more use of mobile for different types of communication, There was absolutely no difference in any of the different age cohorts that we'd asked about. None. They were all the same readiness for using more mobile. So age often is not the issue.
Right.
No, but I would suggest that their habits and the realities of their work life and their personal life does drive that.
Right.
And I think smart leaders, one of the things that in the everything old is new again, I do like very much how the change in technology has made video relevant again in a big way and in a very fresh way, because it does enable people to connect with leaders, and the leadership skill to be able to communicate through the camera is something very old, but now it's very new. And I think that's a good thing, because it does enable people to get inside a leader's head much more than reading something that was created by a committee does.
And Mark, I think that goes back to the point that you made, and it just struck me when you said we're redefining an awful lot here. We're not reinventing necessarily, we're redefining. And I agree that what you remind me of is the conversation we had before we went on air about that big telephone that I had.
Yes,
and nobody else had.
You always had the cool technology, Jim.
I was the only one in the firm who had it, and my boss said, I can't imagine anybody would need a cell phone. And I said, I'm on airplanes all the time. I need to be able to stay in touch with my clients. You'll never need that. Just when you get back to the office, call them.
Yeah, but you had little pink pieces of paper to tell you who to call too.
Every new technology breeds exactly the same response from lawyers and leaders, which is, we don't need this, or it presents too much of a risk for information to be transmitted outside the organization. I was working with a guy who was part of the greater generation. He was just getting ready to retire about 20 years ago, and he was recalling during a crisis that he was managing for his employer at the time that he wanted a fax machine to make it easier to get information out to the media, and he had to request written permission to lease a fax machine, and the lawyer said, no, that makes it too easy to fax information that isn't supposed to get out of the organization. So this just keeps rearing its ugly head every time a new technology is introduced to the workplace. When
was the last time you asked your physician if he or she could fax something to you? No, HIPAA won't let you do it.
Well, HIPAA's a whole
other conversation.
But I would also suggest that we as communicators have to be careful about every time there's a new technology, not thinking or reacting that it's all we need. That if there's a moral to this story today, to this conversation, is that people are complicated. They've always been complicated. Choices are many. There have always been many choices. And that it does require a carefully tailored mix according to the relationship that the organization's trying to build. That hasn't changed. It's just that we every year get new toys to play with.
And the mix doesn't necessarily have to conflate with generations. For example, some people are better visual learners. Some people are better auditory learners.
So. And we need to look at channels fit for purpose, because I've seen too many online discussions of, oh, we want to get rid of the internet and just replace it with a bunch of apps, or we want to kill email and just put everything on social media. Well, they're not fit for purpose. When you're needing to get a lot of information to people, you need to push it to them. Social media won't do it. The internet is one place you can organize a lot of archive of information. I mean, on my phone has so many apps, I can't find an app on it. You know, it's crazy.
But you probably only use 6 of those anyway on any kind of recurring basis. So we're down to about a minute left in the discussion. I'm going to have you go around and share one last thought before we sign off. Before we do, I want to let everyone know that the next Circle of Fellows will be on January 19th. Same time, noon Eastern. The topic is social media measurement. So here we are talking about all of these different channels that are necessary, but we're going to focus in on social media and how to determine its effectiveness. And also, I suspect we'll talk about measurement that informs the approaches that we take to using social media. So that's coming up on the 19th. Mark your calendars. And I want to thank Anna Willey, by the way, who is an IABC Fellow and has stepped up to really help with the administration of Circle of Fellows, so I don't have to, planning the topics and lining up participants. So let's go down the row of thumbnails on the bottom of the screen and get one last thought on all of this from you. And I'll go right to left this time. Paul, how about starting with you?
Well, first of all, it's always wonderful to be in the company of people who are in the field and are so articulate about the issues. My takeaway, and I hope that we all continue to recognize that IABC and learning go together, and that we have had many opportunities to help the propagation of communications at a high level, and that's what this kind of discussion does. So hats off to Shell and all of the fellows who are participating.
Jim?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, and we can get enwrapped with the generation issue, but as I mentioned earlier, that is only one way to segment people. We've got genders, races, Myers-Briggs types, socioeconomic backgrounds. One of the things in the survey that I conducted came back that yes, we do need to segment people for purposes of having the polisher needs information about how to do polishing better for the customer. Absolutely. But we need to be focusing more on things that we have similarities around, like our values, our purpose, our need for respect, our leaders we can count on, learning opportunities, feedback, and things like that. I hope communication practitioners will focus on similarities more than the things that divide us. I don't think we need, as a society, any more discussion about how we're so divided.
Mark?
As you think about the things we've talked about, don't be afraid to declutter your communication life. Just like the closets or the garage at our house, we put in new things, we need to get rid of old things. And so as we think about the new ways to connect, let's make sure that we're not just adding noise to the effort to connect, and be willing to declutter or sunset approaches as we need to.
And so I would just finish with that, is that the way you do that is through some research, because you can't rely on common wisdom. You can't rely on all these articles about what the differences are between generations, because they're such stereotypes. What you need to figure out for each organization is based on the current mix of channels you have, the level of communication your leaders have, what's working, what could be done better, which topics need to be communicated in which ways. We know we need to use multiple channels, but Mark, as you said, we don't have to have 100 different channels available. Figure out which are the most commonly preferred for each different topic and focus on those, and let the other ones sunset away.
Great. Sorry to have vanished there. My computer just froze for a minute. By the way, we have a parting comment from Natalie Setman. I'm hoping I'm getting that pronunciation right, who says, nice discussion. Would have been even nicer to see more generations represented among the speakers, though. And I think it is a condition of being a fellow that we've been around a long time before we get nominated for this. But we'll do our best to even bring more generations into the ranks of the fellows.
Oh,
so,
what do they know?
Yeah, that's right. Those damn kids. Get off my lawn. So thanks, everybody, for participating, and we'll see you back here on January 19th.
Sounds good. Thanks, Shell.
Happy holiday.
Bye-bye.
Happy holiday.
Bye.